Eating together was never a small thing in the world of Jesus. It was not a simple act of hospitality. It was not a neutral social habit. And it was never just about food. In first-century Judea, eating together carried meaning that went far beyond nourishment. It defined who belonged, it signaled who was accepted, and it revealed who was excluded. This is why meals appear so frequently in the gospel narratives, and this is why they provoked such intense reactions. Again and again, conflict does not arise around Jesus' miracles alone, nor only around his teaching. It arises around tables. To understand why eating together meant everything in Jesus' world, we must reconstruct what meals represented within first-century Jewish society, socially, religiously, and politically. In the ancient Mediterranean world, meals were structured events governed by honor, status, and boundary. This was true across cultures. But within Judaism, it carried an additional layer of meaning. The Torah shaped not only what could be eaten, but how meals were prepared, who could participate, and under what conditions. Leviticus chapter 11 defines clean and unclean animals, regulating what entered the body. Deuteronomy chapters 12 and 14 govern slaughter, blood consumption, and sacred portions. Exodus chapter 12 establishes ritual meals such as Passover, eaten in precise ways by defined participants. But written law was only the foundation. Daily meals were shaped by tradition, what later rabbinic literature would call halakha, the lived interpretation of the law. This meant that eating was never merely biological. It was an act of obedience. Every meal carried religious weight. Archaeology confirms this integration of purity concerns into ordinary life. Stone vessels, immune to ritual impurity according to Jewish law, appear frequently in domestic contexts throughout Judea and Galilee. These were not ceremonial objects reserved for priests. They were household items. Their presence indicates that concerns associated with the temple extended into kitchens, storage rooms, and dining spaces. The table became a domestic extension of sacred logic. Who touched the food mattered. Who prepared it mattered. Who shared it mattered. Eating together created shared space, shared status, and shared responsibility. This is why meals functioned as boundary markers. To share a meal was to recognize someone as part of one's moral and religious world. To refuse table fellowship was to deny that recognition. Under Roman occupation, these boundaries took on heightened importance. Foreign rule intensified concern for identity preservation. Purity laws, food practices, and table fellowship distinguished Israel from surrounding cultures and from those within Israel who were perceived as compromised. Tax collectors associated with Roman authority fell into this category. Their profession involved cooperation with imperial systems and frequent contact with Gentiles. Others labeled as sinners were those who publicly violated the law or failed to observe accepted norms. Gentiles, unless specific precautions were taken, were generally excluded from shared meals. The Mishnah, compiled later but preserving earlier traditions, reflects these concerns repeatedly. It discusses who may eat together, what happens if someone of uncertain status touches food, and how vessels transmit impurity. These were not abstract discussions. They governed daily life. Against this backdrop, the behavior of Jesus becomes far more disruptive than it may initially appear. The Gospels consistently portray Jesus eating with people who were normally excluded from table fellowship. In Luke chapter 5, Levi the tax collector hosts a large banquet for Jesus. The guest list is explicit. Many tax collectors and others described as sinners are present. The Pharisees and scribes respond immediately. They question Jesus' disciples, asking why he eats and drinks with such people. The objection is not theological. It is not about doctrine or teaching. It is about boundaries. By eating with them, Jesus publicly recognizes them. He treats them as acceptable participants in shared life. This challenges the social mechanisms that maintained separation. In Luke chapter 7, Jesus eats in the house of a Pharisee. During the meal, a woman described as a sinner enters the space and approaches him. The host's reaction is internal but clear. If this man were a prophet, he would know who and what sort of woman this is. The assumption reveals the logic at work. Holiness is demonstrated by separation. Righteousness is guarded through exclusion. Association implies endorsement. And the table is where that endorsement becomes visible. In Mark chapter 2, the accusation becomes direct and public. Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? This is not casual curiosity. It is legal in tone. It frames Jesus' behavior as a violation of accepted norms. From a historical perspective, scholars have emphasized that these practices were not trivial. E.P. Sanders argues that purity laws and social boundaries functioned as identity markers, particularly under foreign domination. They were not expressions of arrogance. They were mechanisms of survival. Paula Fredrickson notes that shared meals reinforced covenantal loyalty. Eating together signaled shared commitments and shared standing before God. To disrupt table fellowship was to disrupt identity itself. Jesus does exactly that. He does not merely argue against exclusion. He undermines it through practice. He eats with those who are excluded. He allows them to share space, food, and presence. This redefines the meaning of belonging. Even disputes about hand-washing before meals, recorded in Mark chapter 7, reflect this same tension. The issue is not hygiene, it is authority. Who has the right to define what defiles a person? The Pharisees object because Jesus' disciples eat without observing traditional hand-washing. Jesus responds by shifting the focus from external practices to internal disposition. This is not a rejection of the law. It is a challenge to a particular interpretation of it. And once again, the issue emerges at the table. Meals become recurring evidence against Jesus. Luke chapter 15 summarizes the complaint succinctly. This man receives sinners and eats with them. The language is deliberate. Receiving implies welcome. Eating implies recognition. Together, they form an accusation. Jesus is not merely tolerating the excluded. He is including them. This inclusion has consequences. Meals involving Jesus attract scrutiny. They provoke suspicion. They contribute to the perception that he threatens social and religious order. In a society where boundaries were maintained through daily practice, this was dangerous. All of this gives deeper meaning to the Last Supper. Jesus gathers his disciples for a Passover meal. This is a ritual meal deeply tied to memory, covenant, and identity. Passover commemorates liberation from slavery. It reinforces communal belonging. But during this meal, Jesus introduces a transformation. He takes bread, the foundation of every meal, and identifies it with his body. He takes wine, shared and symbolic, and connects it to covenant. He does this not in the temple, but at a table. The group itself is significant. Fishermen from Galilee, a tax collector, men without priestly status. The table becomes the place where belonging is redefined. Participation in the meal becomes the marker. Eating together takes on a new meaning. It is no longer only about shared purity. It is about shared allegiance. Meals in Jesus' world were never casual. They carried social meaning. They carried religious significance. They carried power. To eat together was to decide who belonged. Jesus understood this, and he used the table as a place of confrontation, not through speeches, not through force, but through the deliberate act of eating with the wrong people. Understanding this helps explain why meals appear so frequently in the gospel narratives, and why they provoked such strong reactions. Because in the world of Jesus, eating together meant everything.